All right, so we have 6 groups, and so let's start with group number 1. Is an odd number, so we have 3 questions for group number 1. Who is the reporter? Or who's going to report back to us?
So our reporter is Antoine Perrier from University of Virginia on biology.
Hi. Yeah, so we decided to actually answer the questions of the even because we are mostly a lot of international people with maybe less experience about the BSA and everything. So we decided to go more with the research questions. And we got on mostly only the time to answer the first 2. So do you want me to just go through all of the things we discussed, or?
Yeah, just briefly, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so for the first question, which was, what are some of the challenges in climate research? There was some discussion about the fact that we often have mostly global climatic models to work on, and we lack fine-scale environmental data, but fine-scale environmental data might actually be the most important one for tracking response. There's the issue of funding, which is an issue in many countries, and particularly funding for long-term research projects. Speaking of long-term research project, given that we are experiencing already a pretty decent amount of climate change, what is a baseline we're working with when we don't have like resurrection studies and this kind of thing? So this was an issue. Then there was also distinguishing the effects of continuous climate change versus local or very extreme events. Which ones are the ones that we are capturing and which one are the ones that matter the most for species response? And then for the second question, what are some of the conservation challenges? I think there was a big discussion about conserving single species and putting a lot of effort into single species versus actually focusing on preserving communities or ecosystems. And in the same context, there was the practicality of developing extensive models to predict conservation needs of a single species. But also there was some discussion about the use, like how useful like case studies in actually guiding conservation projects. And I think that's most of what we got discussed.
I think we can move to the next group number 2, unless you have a question for group number 1. No? Okay. Then group number 2 is even, so you have 4 questions to address.
Okay. I'm Tana Bush, biologist for a municipality in Florida, and I'm the speaker for this group. We did the evens because we're even. For the challenges in climate research, none of us really have a background as researchers in climate science, so we focused more on a practitioner basis, and we kind of find challenges in that there's not enough research on for how as land practitioners or policymakers or other biologists, how we're to address issues, whether it's invasive species spread, imperiled species tolerances to climate changes, stuff like that. We're kind of lacking in more research and advice on how to deal with those kind of problems. Some of the conservation challenges, we actually had a lot for those. Policy and legal slowdown in general, challenges with maybe not enough protections in certain instances, maybe like state laws versus federal protections, exotic species spread, assisted migration and translocations, how to do them well, when to do them, if doing them is actually going to cause more harm than good. Dealing with certain parts of the country's extreme climates like the Southwest or California wildfires. In the Southeast, we have worsening storms. Let's see. I think that was most of the conservation challenges we got through. How can plants be used to mitigate climate change? Lots of ways. Plants can help with shoreline armoring, can help with wetland restoration. We discussed a little bit of looking into different plants and the uses of crops, whether it's improving crop species diversity that we actually consume, looking into using plants for other purposes, the diversity in medicinal uses, things even like algae as biofuel or algae used for other ways to maybe combat climate change. A lot of positive uses. The emerging frontiers in climate science. Like I said, we're not climate scientists, so none of us really had a whole lot of ideas on that, but we had talked about a couple like new atmosphere building or creation. I think there was one mention of maybe other planets, looking into fire regimes and other natural processes in different parts of the country, like fire regimes out west in California, where they're having it seen as worsening and worsening wildfire conditions.
Thank you. So in light of time, let's continue with the next group, number 3, and it's an odd number. So let's see what they have to say about these 3 questions.
I'm Kathy Keeler. I'm long-term retired from the University of Nebraska. We didn't choose a leader, but looking at the time, I will step in. I was trying to make some notes afterwards. We asked, first off, what can plants do? Because that was such an easy, comfortable question, and said plant trees. And I'd say we need to think about which trees where and how on a global scale we can get carbon storage without necessarily planting trees that the climate killed. We stepped then after that into non-traditional forms of funding, and I think that for me, I would say it depends on how much funding you need. If you just need to have a person go out and take notes, then there are lots of sources of funding. And a computer, I guess, because from local governments, parks and recs, other kinds of unusual choices of industry that will support that on unfortunately a very small scale for in going into the future if as an alternative to standard sources. Of course, there are lists of small scale funding agencies as well, but they tend to be pretty much overwhelmed. And finally, if you imagine that the funding was going to suddenly end, my experience as a university professor included any number of interesting years of budget cuts where we pretended that we were going to get a 50% cut. They didn't usually do that to us, but it was exciting. You should look at what you actually have to have and see how much you can support it for the year, because usually these things are a transitional period. If you survive the load period, things get better. But you have to ask, what do I have to have not to be really unhappy with the long-term data set because there were because of the missing years. Anybody else from my group want to make a comment?
You did great.
Any questions for this group? Okay, so let's move on to group number 4.
So Jill Anderson was our leader in group 4, but she had to step out. So I will report. I'm Dave Gorchov from Miami University. We actually started with one of the questions from an odd-numbered group, which was the funding challenges. And we pointed out there's some ways to leverage existing long-term data sets to mine them for information using citizen science data, such as Project Budburst. and using remote sensing data, which are typically expensive, but one of our group members pointed out there was a next view, that's one word, licenses available where if you have a federal grant, you can apply for a license to use archived remote sensing imagery. For research challenges, of course, there were a lot. One that our group emphasized was the shifting targets. You may be intending to research a particular temperature increase, but the temperature's already increased more than that. And others, there are multiple drivers. Our study sites are also impacted by invasive species, habitat change, not just climate. We spend a fair amount of time on conservation challenges. While it's compelling to do assisted translocation or gene flow, who should manage this? Lots of complexities. How do we avoid mistakes of introducing invasives? Dealing with regulatory compliance. Do we need to worry about moving pollinators or other mutualists or soil microbes? If we move soil, are we risking soil pathogens? And do we have to wait till we really know what the requirements are of these species, or do we need to move them now? Members of our group also pointed out that there are these sudden changes where the fire regime has changed and the community is very degraded. You can't just wait for gradual shifts. You need to do restoration scale planting, but we don't have, in many cases, enough different species of seeds. We don't have seeds sourced from the right locations. Currently, the Forest Service is looking into improving the availability of seeds for restoration. And that kind of brought up this broader issue that we need to foster better collaboration between plant scientists and climate change science on the one hand, restoration practitioners. There's already a great body of expertise in restoration ecology and restoration practice. But how often is that tied in with these shifting climates? And then the conservation community that's often focused on conserving specific species or specific places. There needs to be enhanced dialogue. Maybe that's a future BSA Symposium topic, collaborations between these different fields. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. We have 5 more minutes and we have 2 more groups. So group number 5, please.
Hello, my name is Michelle Moshon. I'm an urban park ranger for the city of New York. I believe that Jeffrey was the leader for our group. He did a great job, and we had the odd number of room questions. And so I'm just going to start from the top and go down. For the first one about how BSA and other scientific societies can engage in climate research, citizen science, and engaging in disseminating more information to the public so that they can help us. We noticed that a lot of the questions for a lot of the speakers were centered on what are recommendations for land management? What are things that we can do to bridge the gap between the research and the real world applications? And so I think that was a very good point that a lot of us made. So far as non-traditional funding sources that scientists might tap into to pilot climate research, again, citizen science, what someone called shovel-ready projects, the idea that once you get a surprise source of even a little bit of funding, you have a way to implement it as soon as possible so that people aren't waiting and they're able to act on it as soon as they can. And also the idea that there might be corporations who are willing to back funding that we're not really thinking about. Corporations that want to be able to say, oh, we funded all these projects in order to help with climate science, but just don't know which scientists to reach out to, or what kind of research would be useful. There's a lot of companies, for example, that are already doing that kind of research in order to have the license to work on land, construction and civil engineering and areas like that that people might not necessarily think of right away. And so far as backup strategies, if current initiatives that have sponsored and tracked climate research are simply in citizen science, mutual aid groups, redundancy and storage, the idea of being able to rely on other groups that are already collecting this data and the kind of data that we currently have available to us will be incredibly important, and perhaps leaning into ways that even if the scientists themselves might not be able to conduct that research, maybe they can teach other people to collect their research, or maybe they find a group that is already collecting that research that they're not expecting. For example, we have a lot of scientists, and it's wonderful that we have so many people on this call for this very specific purpose, but people are into things like plane spotting or trains, might be thinking about the temperature or the wind speed, and who's thinking about that, right? So maybe like thinking out of the box of who else can we collaborate with for these initiatives. And we're not thinking about airplanes as a conservation effort, but maybe people who are collecting this data that you wouldn't expect to. Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. We appreciate that. And the last group is number 6. Let's take a few more minutes. We're running a little bit late. Have 3:29 Eastern time, but we can spend a couple of more minutes and discuss the last what the last group has to say. Nick, I think it is you.
Vivian, that's your group too. That's yeah. So I think that what's been said has been very summative of what we said as well too. Just pointing out a couple challenges associated with climate research that also are challenges for conservation. It seems like seed banks and dormancy, things that we know the least about, and are the hardest transitions to measure, are they're a challenge to get at, and that's something that we need to think about. And when we're forming these different models, it was immediately apparent that some of us work on widespread species, and those are our model systems often, and others of us work on very threatened species that only have a few endemic ecosystems and communities like actually left as populations. And we have to think about how to translate the research from our widespread models to our threatened species, if that exists, and especially for our management strategies, because a lot of our management will be done using things that are non-threatened first to discover the application of it and the risks of it as well too. So it seems like bridging some of these gaps and thinking about how research translates from these few species that we know a lot about to all of the species that are actually going to have these issues is really important. Further, the long scale stuff that has gone on at Rumble is clearly really, really cool and really informative for us. I don't know what we do without those long-term resources, but not all of our different communities have those long-term resources. So can we apply those to what we're doing right now? As we went down the list here, I think most of the things have probably been said already in here. I think that we talked a little bit about how plants can be used to mitigate climate change too, and I thought Group 2 did a wonderful job of summarizing that. But we brought up several issues that we have some greenscaping issues going on too. Like we're losing our local field station to a solar farm. There's another field station that was being lost in Newfoundland for to a wind farm as well too. So we're trying to account for certain climate issues and not making the climate worse, while we're kind of degrading our plant communities already, things that may be storing carbon and performing functions. So it's kind of we're really competing against ourselves in some ways as a society. So I'll just leave it there.
Any other thoughts before closing? Lawrence, you want to close or should I close?
Go ahead and close. I don't have anything profound to say. I think the symposium went super well, and I was impressed by how many people came and all of the great conversations and the discussions and question and answer periods. So I guess the thing I would say is even though I said I wasn't going to close, is thank you everyone for attending and for sharing so many interesting ideas about how we might think about climate change.
Thank you, Loren, and thanks a lot for the speakers, both featured and contributed speakers, and these discussion sessions, very informative. And tomorrow we have another set of speakers and another discussion session, and we would hope that see you there. With this, thanks a lot and have a great day.